Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man's Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Vincent Kowalski, but everyone just calls me Vince. I've been a park ranger for 19 years now, working the night shift in Jefferson National Forest here in Virginia. Most people think being a ranger is all about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires, but my job is different. I patrol Nightmare Ridge during the dark hours, and I deal with things that come out when the sun goes down. I'm 43 years old, built like my Polish grandfather who worked the coal mines back in Pennsylvania. My dad always said the Kowalski men were made for hard work in dark places. That's probably why I ended up doing night patrol instead of the day shift like most rangers prefer. Before this job, I was military police for 8 years. You learn a lot about people in that line of work, how they act when they're scared, when they're lying, when they're about to break. Nightmare Ridge got its name back in the 1860s during the Civil War. There was a battle here that didn't make it into the history books. Local stories say a whole company of Union soldiers got trapped on the ridge and, well, let's just say it didn't end well for them. After the war, some mining company tried to set up shop here, but that failed too. The workers kept leaving, saying they heard things in the dark that made their skin crawl. These days, I get reports maybe once a month about strange sounds coming from the ridge. Hikers and hunters who spend the night up there come back talking about howling that doesn't sound like any animal they know. Some folks say the sounds get inside your head and won't leave you alone. I always tell them the same thing. It's just wolves being territorial. Sounds different at night when you're tired and your imagination is running wild. I've got all the right equipment for my job. Night vision goggles that the Forest Service got us in '83, a good radio that USU. Ally works, and enough experience to know the difference between a wolf pack and a bunch of coyotes. I keep logs of all the animal sounds I hear, and I've recorded plenty of wolf calls over the years. Never heard anything that couldn't be explained by basic wildlife behavior and maybe a little too much whiskey around the campfire. But last week, something changed. It started when they brought in 3 hikers from separate trips, all found in the same condition. They were sitting by their cold campfires, staring at nothing, not responding to questions. When the paramedics checked them over, each one had cuts on their arms and hands, neat, straight lines that formed weird patterns. The cuts weren't deep enough to be dangerous, but they were too precise to be accidents. The thing that bothered everyone was that none of the hikers remembered making the cuts. They didn't even remember hearing any unusual sounds. One minute they were enjoying a nice evening under the stars, the next minute they were being shaken awake by search and rescue teams. Dr. Lisa Chen, a psychiatrist from the university, came out to interview them. She'd worked with trauma victims before, but she said she'd never seen anything like this. It's like they experienced something so overwhelming that their minds just shut down to protect them, she told me over coffee at the ranger station. That's when I decided to spend a few extra nights on the ridge myself. If there was something up there affecting people, I needed to figure out what it was. Could be a rabid animal making strange sounds, or maybe some kind of environmental factor. Gas leaking from one of the old mine shafts, something that could cause hallucinations. I've dealt with plenty of scared people in my time as a ranger, and before that in the military. Fear makes folks see things that aren't there and hear sounds that don't exist. But 3 separate incidents in 1 week? That was worth investigating. So here I am, walking the trail up to Nightmare Ridge on a cold November night, carrying my usual gear plus a digital recorder and a camera. The moon is about half full, giving me just enough light to see the path without using my flashlight too much. The woods are quiet except for the normal sounds, owls calling, small animals rustling through the dead leaves, the wind moving through the bare branches. I've been up this trail hundreds of times over the years. I know every rock, every turn, every spot where the path gets tricky. Tonight feels the same as always, but I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me walk up the mountain. Maybe it's just because I'm thinking about those hikers and their strange cuts, Or maybe it's because I know that somewhere up ahead, in that old mass grave that most people don't know exists, there are bones of soldiers who died badly and were never properly buried. Either way, I'm about to find out what's really happening on Nightmare Ridge. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I've been walking these woods for almost 2 decades, and I know what nighttime sounds like. There should be insects buzzing, small animals moving around, maybe a distant owl call or the sound of deer picking their way through the underbrush. But as I got closer to the ridge, all of that just stopped. It was like someone had turned down the volume on the whole forest. I stopped walking and stood there for a minute, listening. My radio crackled with static, which was normal up here. The mountains played hell with radio signals. But the static seemed different tonight, almost like it had a rhythm to it. I turned the volume down and kept walking. The trail to the ridge climbs pretty steep for the last half-mile. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing hard and my legs were feeling it. But the weird silence was still there, and now I could see why the place had gotten its name. The ridge is mostly bare rock, with just a few scraggly trees that look like they're trying to escape. During the day, it's actually pretty scenic. At night, with that half-moon casting shadows everywhere, it looks like something out of a nightmare. I found a good spot where I could see most of the ridge and settled in to wait. If there were wolves or coyotes making unusual sounds, they'd probably show up sometime between midnight and dawn. That's when most predators do their hunting. I set up my recorder and checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. Perfect timing. For the next hour, nothing happened. The silence continued, which was strange enough, but nothing that would drive hikers crazy. I was starting to think this trip was going to be a waste of time when I heard the first howl. It came from somewhere across the ridge, maybe 200 yards away. Long and low, rising and falling like a regular wolf call. I'd heard thousands of wolf calls over the years, and this one sounded normal enough. I made a note in my log and kept listening. 5 minutes later, there was another howl, this time from a different direction, then another, then another. Within 10 minutes, I was hearing howls from all around the ridge. That made sense. Wolves hunt in packs, and they use howling to coordinate their movements. What didn't make sense was how many there were. I counted at least 8 or 9 different voices, which would be a huge pack for this area. But the really strange part was the timing. The howls weren't random like they should be. They were coming in a pattern, like the wolves were taking turns. One would howl, then stop exactly when the next one started. It was too organized, too precise. I turned on my recorder and waited for the next round of calls. When they came, I got the whole thing on tape. Playing it back through my headphones, I could hear something I'd missed before. Underneath the wolf sounds, there was something else. A low, humming noise, almost like singing. Gee. That's when I saw the first one. It was standing about 50 yards away, next to one of the scraggly trees. In the moonlight, it looked like a large dog, or maybe a small wolf. But as I watched through my binoculars, something was wrong with its shape. The head was too big, and the way it was standing didn't look natural. I tried to get a better look, but it moved behind the tree. When I focused on that spot again, there was nothing there. More howling started up, and this time I could tell it was getting closer. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the ridge, looking for movement. The light caught something white lying on the ground about 30 feet away, too pale to be a rock. I walked over to check it out and found a backpack. It was new, expensive looking, the kind hikers use for overnight trips. I opened it up and found a wallet inside with ID cards for someone named Marcus Webb. According to the driver's license, he was from Richmond, 26 years old. This had to be one of the hikers they'd found last week. I was looking through the rest of the pack when the howling started again, and this time I could tell it was right on top of me. The sounds were coming from every direction, like I was surrounded, but I couldn't see anything moving. That's when I noticed my hands were shaking. Not from cold or fear. I'd been in enough dangerous situations to know what fear felt like. This was different. The shaking was coming from inside, like the sound waves were getting into my bones and rattling them around. I turned off my flashlight and tried to listen more carefully. The howling was definitely doing something to my body. My heart rate was going up, and I was starting to feel dizzy. The low humming sound underneath the wolf calls was getting louder, and now I could make out what sounded like human voices mixed in with the animal sounds. The voices were singing, but not in English. It sounded like an old language, maybe Native American or something from the Civil War era. And the tune was familiar somehow, like a song I'd heard a long time ago but couldn't quite remember. I tried to use my radio to call back to the ranger station, but all I got was static with that same rhythmic pattern I'd heard earlier. The static was so loud it hurt my ears, and underneath it I could hear the singing getting stronger. That's when I realized the singing wasn't coming from my radio. It was coming from the ridge itself, from the ground under my feet. And as I listened, I could make out words in English mixed in with the foreign language. Help us. So cold. Can't rest. Make them pay. I've seen a lot of strange things in my 19 years as a ranger, but I'd never heard dead people singing before. Because that's what this was. I was sure of it now. The voices were coming from that mass grave the old-timers talked about, the place where the Union soldiers had been buried without proper ceremony. The howling stopped suddenly, and the silence came back. But now the silence felt different. It felt like something was waiting. I packed up my gear and started walking back down the trail as fast as I could without running. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared. Not of wolves or coyotes or any other animal, but of something that didn't belong in the natural world. Something that wanted me to stay on that ridge and sing along with their endless, angry song. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that singing, those voices asking for help and talking about making someone pay. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed backup for this one. Dr. Lisa Chen was the first person I called. She'd been asking to come up to the ridge anyway, wanting to see where the affected hikers had been camping. When I told her what I had experienced, she got very quiet for a long moment. "Vince," she said finally, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been having any unusual dreams lately? Any difficulty sleeping?" "Doc, I know how this sounds, but I recorded the whole thing. You can hear it for yourself." She agreed to meet me at the ranger station that afternoon, and I also called Magnus Pike. Magnus is a local historian, probably in his 70s now, who knows more about this area than anyone alive. If there was a reasonable explanation for what was happening, he'd know it. When Dr. Chen arrived, I played her the recording from the night before. She listened to the whole thing twice, wearing headphones and taking notes. When she was done, her face was pale. "This is impossible," she said. "These sound patterns, they're designed to trigger specific psychological responses. Fear, disorientation, memory disruption. But no animal could create sounds like this naturally." "What do you mean?" "The frequency patterns are too precise. It's like someone engineered these sounds to affect human brain chemistry. But that would require knowledge of neuroscience that didn't exist until the 1970s. Magnus arrived while we were talking and listened to the recording as well. His reaction was different. He just nodded like he'd been expecting this. "The Kowalski boy found them," he said quietly. "I was wondering when they'd start singing again." He told us the real story of what happened on Nightmare Ridge during the Civil War. A company of Union soldiers had been trapped there by Confederate forces and tortured for information about troop movements. When they wouldn't talk, the Confederates had done things to them that Magnus wouldn't describe in detail. They weren't just killed, he explained. They were broken, mentally, physically, spiritually. And when they finally died, they were thrown into a pit without ceremony, without proper burial rites, without even having their names recorded. According to Magnus, the soldiers had been singing an old hymn while they were being tortured, trying to keep their spirits up. The song had become mixed with their screams and their pleas for help, and somehow that combination had soaked into the ground itself. "Every 20 or 30 years, someone hears them singing," Magnus said. "Usually just one person. And they either go crazy or they leave the area and never come back. But this is the first time multiple people have been affected." Dr. Chen was skeptical of the supernatural explanation, but she couldn't argue with the psychological effects. Whether it's ghosts or some kind of natural acoustic phenomenon, Those sounds are definitely causing trauma responses. The victims are experiencing what sounds like severe PTSD symptoms. We decided to go up to the ridge together that night. Dr. Chen wanted to document the psychological effects. Magnus wanted to see if his historical knowledge could help. And I needed to understand what was happening in my forest. We started hiking up the trail just after sunset, all of us carrying recording equipment and cameras. The plan was to observe from a safe distance and gather as much data as possible. The silence started again about halfway up the trail, just like the night before. Dr. Chen noticed it immediately. "This is neurologically impossible," she whispered. "Fear responses don't work this way. It's like something is directly stimulating our fight-or-flight systems." When we reached the ridge, Magnus led us to a spot I'd never seen before, a depression in the rock that was mostly hidden by scrub brush. When we cleared away the vegetation, we could see that the depression was actually a carefully arranged pile of stones with symbols carved into them. "This is where they're buried," Magnus said. "The Confederates marked the spot, but they used symbols from their own folk magic traditions instead of proper Christian markings. They were trying to make sure the dead stayed dead. The symbols were weird, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, like they were designed to confuse the eye." Chen was photographing them when the first howl started. This time I was ready for the physical effects. The shaking started in my hands and spread up my arms, but I was able to stay focused. Through my binoculars, I could see shapes moving around the burial site. Tall, thin figures that looked almost human but moved wrong, like their joints bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. "Do you see them?" I asked Dr. Chen. She was staring through her own binoculars and her hands were shaking worse than mine. "I see something, but it can't be real. Shared hallucinations don't work this way." The figures were getting clearer now. They looked like Civil War soldiers, but their faces were wrong, twisted with pain and rage, with empty holes where their eyes should be. They were opening their mouths impossibly wide and making the howling sounds, but underneath the animal noises, I could hear human voices singing that hymn Magnus had mentioned. The singing was getting louder, and I could feel it working on my mind. My vision was starting to blur, and I was having trouble remembering why I was there. The voices were so sad, so desperate, that all I wanted to do was help them somehow. That's when Dr. Chen screamed. She was on her knees, tearing at her jacket sleeves with her fingernails, trying to get to the skin underneath. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, and she was muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. "She's experiencing their memories," Magnus said, pulling out a small silver cross. "The trauma is transferring to her. We need to get her away from here." I tried to pick up Dr. Chen, but she fought me, clawing at her arms and repeating the same phrase over and over. "Tell them where. Tell them where. Tell them where." The soldier figures were moving closer now, and I could see that some of them were wearing wolf pelts over their uniforms. Their howling was getting so loud that I couldn't think straight, and I was starting to understand what had happened to those hikers. The dead soldiers weren't just singing, they were trying to share their memories, their pain, their desperate need for someone to know what had been done to them. And they were using the wolf howls to carry those memories directly into living minds. I managed to get Dr. Chen over my shoulder and started running down the trail with Magnus right behind me. The howling followed us for almost a mile before it finally faded away. By the time we reached the ranger station, Dr. Chen had stopped fighting and was just crying quietly. Her arms were covered with scratches that formed the same geometric patterns we'd seen on the other victims. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded different, older, more tired. "I remember being tortured," she whispered. "I remember dying. But it wasn't me. It was them. They made me remember what happened to them." That's when I realized we were dealing with something much worse than just ghosts. These weren't spirits looking for peace or trying to move on to whatever comes next. These were traumatized souls trying to make the living world share their pain. And they were getting stronger. Dr. Chen spent the next day in the hospital, sedated and under observation. The scratches on her arms had become infected, and she kept talking about Civil War battles like she'd been there personally. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I was starting to understand. Magnus and I spent that day researching everything we could find about the Civil War incident on Nightmare Ridge. What we discovered made my blood run cold. The soldiers who'd been tortured weren't just random casualties. They'd been a special reconnaissance unit, trained in psychological warfare techniques that were advanced for their time. They'd been taught songs and chants designed to keep their minds focused under extreme stress. When they were captured, they'd used those same techniques to try to survive the torture. But the combination of their mental training and the horrific things done to them had created something unnatural. Their consciousness had become fused with their trauma, and when they died, that fusion had soaked into the ground. They're not trying to move on, Magnus explained. They can't. Their training taught them to never break, never surrender, never stop fighting, so they've been fighting for over 100 years. Fighting what? Anyone who comes near their burial site. They see every living person as a potential threat, someone who might hurt them again. So they try to transfer their trauma to the living, to make us understand what they went through. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of going up to the ridge, I drove to the county library and spent hours reading about Civil War military psychology and burial customs. If these soldiers were stuck because they hadn't been properly honored, maybe there was a way to give them what they needed. What I found was a Union Army manual from 1863 that included specific procedures for battlefield burials. According to the manual, soldiers who died in service were supposed to be buried with full military honors, including a formal reading of their names and service records. The soldiers on Nightmare Ridge had never received those honors. They'd been thrown into a pit like garbage with no recognition of their sacrifice. I called Magnus and told him what I'd learned. He was quiet for a long time before he spoke. Vince, that might work, but someone would have to perform the ceremony on the ridge itself, right over their burial site. And they might not let you do it. They might see you as another enemy trying to hurt them. I knew he was right, but I also knew I couldn't let this continue. More people were going to get hurt, and eventually someone was going to die from the trauma transfer. It was my job to protect the people who visited this forest, and that included protecting them from century-old ghosts. The next night, I hiked up to Nightmare Ridge carrying a copy of the Union Army Burial Manual, a small American flag, and a list of names that Magnus had found in Confederate military records, the names of the soldiers who'd been tortured and killed. I also brought my service pistol, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against the dead. The silence started as soon as I stepped onto the ridge, but this time I kept walking straight to the burial site. The carved stones were glowing faintly in the moonlight, and I could see dark stains on the rock that looked like old blood. I set up the flag next to the grave and opened the manual to the section on battlefield burial ceremonies. My hands were shaking, but I started reading aloud. We are gathered here to honor the brave soldiers who gave their lives in service to their country. The howling started immediately, but it sounded different this time, less like animal calls and more like human voices crying out in pain. The soldier figures began appearing around the burial site, but instead of moving toward me, they seemed to be watching and waiting. I read through the entire ceremony, including the part about recognizing their sacrifice and ensuring their memory would be preserved. When I got to the section where I was supposed to read their names, I pulled out Magnus's list. Private Thomas Anderson, 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry. As I spoke each name, one of the ghostly figures would step forward and salute. Their faces were still twisted with pain, but I could see something changing in their expressions. Corporal Michael O'Brien, 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry. The howling was getting quieter, and the wolf-like shapes were starting to look more human. I could see their actual faces now, young men, most of them probably not even 20 years old when they died. Sergeant William Hayes, 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry. By the time I finished reading all 17 names, the howling had stopped completely, and the soldier figures were standing at attention in a perfect formation, no longer looking like the twisted, pain-filled creatures I'd seen before. The sergeant stepped forward and saluted me. When he opened his mouth, his voice was clear and strong. "Thank you, Ranger. We can rest now." One by one, the soldiers began to fade away, their faces peaceful for the first time in over a century. The last to disappear was a young private who couldn't have been more than 18 when he died. He looked directly at me and smiled. "Tell them we were brave," he said. "Tell them we never broke." Then they were gone, and the normal sounds of the forest came rushing back. Insects buzzing, animals moving through the underbrush, the wind in the trees. I sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of life returning to Nightmare Ridge. The carved stones had stopped glowing, and the dark stains on the rock were gone. Even the air felt different, cleaner somehow, like a storm had passed. When I finally hiked back down to the ranger station, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in one night. But I also felt something I hadn't expected: proud. Those soldiers had been forgotten, their sacrifice ignored, their suffering dismissed as just another casualty of war. Now they could finally rest. That was 3 months ago, and Nightmare Ridge has been quiet ever since. The normal sounds of wildlife have returned, and hikers report nothing more unusual than the occasional deer or raccoon sighting. Dr. Chen recovered completely, though she says she still has vivid dreams about Civil War battles. She's written several papers about trauma transfer and supernatural psychology, though she's careful not to claim that ghosts are real. The medical community wouldn't take her seriously if she did. Magnus helped me research the soldiers' families, and we managed to track down descendants of 12 of the 17 men who died on the ridge. We sent them copies of the service records and told them their ancestors had been honored with a proper military burial ceremony. Most of them wrote back with thanks, saying they'd always wondered what had happened to their Civil War ancestors. The county decided to install a small memorial plaque at the base of the trail leading to Nightmare Ridge. It doesn't mention ghosts or howling or supernatural phenomena, just honors the brave soldiers of the 3rd Pennsylvania Infantry who died in service to their country. As for me, I requested a transfer to day shift duties. I told my supervisor that 19 years of night patrol was enough, and I wanted to spend some time helping families and teaching kids about forest safety. He didn't ask too many questions, probably because he'd heard rumors about what happened on the ridge. The truth is, I can't handle the dark anymore. Every time the sun goes down, I hear echoes of that howling, and I remember what it felt like to have someone else's memories forced into my head. The Army gave me training to resist psychological warfare, but nothing prepared me for the kind of trauma those soldiers had experienced. I sleep with the lights on now, and I probably always will. But I don't regret what I did. Those 17 young men deserve to be remembered, deserve to have their sacrifice acknowledged. They'd been carrying that pain for over a century, and all they wanted was for someone to know they'd been brave. The Forest Service has classified the incident as a wildlife management success and filed all the paperwork under routine animal behavior studies. That's fine with me. The people who need to know the truth know it, and the soldiers are at peace. Sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed listening to the normal sounds of civilization, cars passing by, neighbors talking, dogs barking, I think about other places where similar things might have happened. Other battlefields where brave men and women died without proper recognition, other burial sites where trauma has oaked into the ground. I wonder if there are other rangers out there, other people whose job it is to walk through dark places and deal with things that shouldn't exist. And I wonder if they know what to do when the dead start singing. If you're one of those people, if you're reading this because you've heard sounds that don't belong in the natural world, let me give you some advice. Don't ignore it. Don't dismiss it as imagination or stress or too much caffeine. Sometimes the dead have something important to tell us, and sometimes they need our help to find peace. But be careful. The trauma that keeps spirits tied to this world is real, and it can transfer to the living if you're not prepared. Make sure you have backup. Make sure you understand what you're dealing with, and make sure you know how to honor the dead properly. Most importantly, remember that behind every ghost story is a human story. Someone who lived, someone who died, someone who deserves to be remembered. The howlers of Nightmare Ridge are quiet now, but their story lives on. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the mountains, I like to think they're finally singing songs of peace instead of songs of pain. Just remember to honor the fallen properly, or their anguish becomes yours. Some battlefield wounds never heal, even in death. But with the right kind of respect, the right kind of ceremony, even the oldest wounds can finally close. My name is Anthony Castellano, but everyone calls me Tony. I've been a park ranger for 16 years now, working the Cave Rescue Unit at Daniel Boone National Forest here in Kentucky. People think it's all about pulling scared tourists out of tight spots, but let me tell you, caves don't mess around. One wrong step, one bad air pocket, one loose rock, and you're done. I grew up in a family that knew danger. My dad worked the coal mines before we came to America from Italy. He taught me to respect the dark places under the earth, but he also taught me not to fear them. The ground speaks if you listen, he used to say in his broken English. But sometimes, Anthony, people hear things that aren't there. That's what I thought about all the stories. You know the ones. Every cave system has them. Spirits in the darkness. Things that watch from the stone. Here in Devil's Den Gorge, the old-timers love to talk about the Watchers. Cherokee ghosts, they say. Ancient guardians protecting burial caves. Complete nonsense, if you ask me. Devil's Den sits 25 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by rappelling down limestone cliffs that drop straight into nothing. It's a massive cave system, over 40 mapped chambers connected by narrow passages and underground rivers. During the Civil War, people hid here. Before that, moonshiners used it to store their liquor. And way before any of that, the Cherokee buried their dead in the deeper chambers. But ghosts? Stone spirits? Come on. I'm a cave rescue specialist, certified by the National Cave Rescue Commission. I carry gas detectors, rope systems, emergency oxygen. I know limestone geology like other people know their neighborhood streets. In 16 years, I've pulled over 300 people out of caves. I've seen panic attacks, hypothermia, broken bones, and near drownings in underground rivers. What I've never seen is anything that couldn't be explained by science. Bad air makes people hallucinate. Echoes play tricks on your ears. Shadows move when your carbide lamp flickers. Tight spaces make even tough guys lose their minds. That's what creates ghost stories, not actual ghosts. At least that's what I believed until September 15th, 1979. The call came in just after sunrise. 3 experienced spelunkers, Jim Bradley, Sarah Chen, and Mike Rodriguez, had been exploring Devil's Den for 2 days. They were supposed to check in yesterday morning. Their car was still at the trailhead, but nobody had seen them. I knew all 3. Good cavers, not the type to take stupid risks. Jim had been exploring Kentucky caves for over a decade. Sarah was a geology professor from the university. Mike grew up in these mountains and knew the cave systems better than most locals. If they were in trouble, it was serious trouble. I loaded my gear into the truck and headed for Devil's Den. The September air was crisp, early autumn settling into the mountains. Leaves were just starting to turn, and morning mist clung to the ridges like smoke. The rappel down to the cave entrance took 20 minutes. Devil's Den opens like a massive mouth in the cliff face, 50 feet wide, 30 feet tall, disappearing into absolute blackness. Standing at that entrance, you always feel small. The mountain seems to lean over you, pressing down with millions of tons of rock. I checked my gear one more time. Carbide lamp, backup flashlight, rope system, air quality detector, first aid kit, emergency beacon, everything a cave rescue specialist needs to bring people home alive. The mouth of Devil's Den breathed cool air that smelled of limestone and deep water. Somewhere in that darkness, 3 people were waiting for help. I lit my carbide lamp and stepped into the mountain. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Caves are never truly quiet. Water drips. Air moves through passages. Bats rustle in the ceiling. Your footsteps echo off stone walls. But Devil's Den felt dead, like walking into a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. I followed the main passage, checking for signs of the missing cavers. Their route was well known, through the cathedral chamber, down to the underground river, then into the maze of side passages where they'd been mapping new sections. 20 minutes in, I found their first camp. The gear was arranged in a perfect circle, not scattered like you'd expect if people had packed up quickly, not organized like a neat campsite, arranged. 3 sleeping bags, 3 backpacks, 3 sets of climbing gear, all positioned exactly the same distance apart, forming a precise geometric pattern. I knelt and examined the arrangement more closely. Each item was sorted by material. All the nylon gear in one section, all the metal equipment in another. Aluminum carabiners separated from steel pitons. It looked like someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder had organized their campsite, but I knew these cavers. They were practical people, not neat freaks. My air quality detector showed normal readings. No dangerous gases, no oxygen depletion. But something felt wrong. The temperature was off. Too warm for this deep in the cave system. And the air wasn't moving right. Instead of flowing from the entrance toward the deeper chambers like it should, currents seemed to be swirling in impossible patterns. I marked the location and continued deeper. The cathedral chamber opened up around me like the inside of a massive church. Limestone formations rose from the floor and hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Normally, this chamber echoed every footstep, every breath. Today, it swallowed sound like a hungry mouth. That's when I found the symbols. Fresh cuts in the limestone walls, carved deep enough to catch the light from my carbide lamp. They weren't Cherokee. I'd seen plenty of ancient petroglyphs in these mountains. They weren't Civil War era either, or Moonshaw, inner marks. These symbols looked like nothing I'd ever encountered. The strange thing was, they looked fresh, like someone had carved them in the last few days. But limestone this hard would take hours of work with proper tools, and the cuts were perfectly smooth. No chisel marks, no rough edges. I touched one of the symbols with my glove. The stone was warm. A sound echoed from deeper in the cave system. Not quite a voice, not quite wind through rock formations. Something in between. I called out, thinking it might be one of the missing cavers. "Jim? Sarah? Mike? This is Ranger Castellano with Cave Rescue." The echo of my voice bounced off the walls and disappeared into the depths. Then silence again. That complete, unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. I followed the passage toward the underground river, where the missing team had planned to continue their survey work. The symbols appeared more frequently as I went deeper, always carved into solid rock, always perfectly smooth, always warm to the touch. At the river crossing, I found more of their gear. This time, the arrangement was even more disturbing. Their climbing ropes were tied in complex knots I didn't recognize, suspended from the ceiling in a pattern that looked almost like a web. Their headlamps were positioned to shine on specific rock formations, creating shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. But no bodies, no signs of struggle, no blood. I tested the water temperature and flow rate. Everything normal. But when I knelt to fill my water bottle, I noticed something that made my hands shake. Footprints in the mud beside the underground river. Bare feet, human-sized, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow. And they didn't lead anywhere. They started at the water's edge and ended 3 steps later, as if whoever made them had simply vanished into those, in air, or merged with the stone wall. I stood up quickly, scanning the chamber with my carbide lamp. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, playing tricks on my eyes. Every rock formation looked like a crouching figure. Every limestone pillar could have been hiding someone. Something was very wrong in Devil's Den. I keyed my radio to call for backup, but got only static. The rock should have blocked transmission, but I'd had radio contact from this depth before. I tried several channels, nothing but white noise that almost sounded like whispering. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Scraping sounds from the passage ahead, like stone rubbing against stone, like something heavy dragging across rock, but rhythmic, deliberate. Not random cave settlement or falling debris. Something was moving in the darkness ahead of me. I unholstered my flashlight, a heavy maglite that could double as a weapon, and started forward. The scraping sounds stopped, then started again, farther away, as if whatever was making them was retreating deeper into the cave system, leading me on. The passage narrowed, forcing me to duck. My carbide flame flickered in air currents that shouldn't exist. The limestone walls pressed close on both sides, and I could feel the weight of the mountain above me like a physical presence. The scraping sounds stopped. I emerged into a chamber I'd never seen before, despite 16 years of exploring this cave system. It was perfectly circular, with walls so smooth they looked polished. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above my light, and carved into every surface were those same mysterious symbols, covering the walls from floor to ceiling. In the center of the chamber sat 3 carbide lamps, still burning. Jim's lamp, Sarah's lamp, Mike's lamp, but no sign of the cavers themselves. I approached the lamps carefully, scanning the chamber for any sign of the missing team. The flames burned steady and bright, as if they'd been lit minutes ago. But carbide lamps only burned for a few hours before running out of fuel. These should have gone. Out yesterday. I picked up Jim's lamp to examine it. The fuel chamber was full, but that wasn't possible. These lamps had been burning for over 24 hours. That's when I noticed the walls were breathing, not moving like loose rock settling, breathing, rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm like massive lungs. The symbols carved into the limestone pulsed with each breath, glowing faintly from within the stone itself. I stumbled backward, my rational mind trying to process what I was seeing. Hallucination from bad air? Carbon monoxide poisoning? Some kind of optical illusion created by the carbide flame? But my gas detector showed normal readings. The air was fine. The chamber breathed around me, and the symbols grew brighter. Somewhere in the darkness above, I heard Sarah's voice calling for help. "Sarah!" I shouted, pointing my light toward the ceiling. "Where are you?" Her voice echoed from impossible directions. Behind me, beside me, from within the walls themselves. "Tony, help us. They're in the stone." I couldn't pinpoint the source. Sound bounced off the breathing walls in ways that defied everything I knew about cave acoustics. My light revealed nothing but smooth limestone and those glowing symbols, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Keep talking," I called. "I'm coming to get you." But her voice faded, replaced by that scraping sound again. This time it came from all around me, as if the chamber walls themselves were moving. I pressed my back against the nearest wall to get my bearings. The stone was warm, almost hot, and I could feel a vibration running through the rock like electricity. The symbols under my hand pulsed brighter at my touch. That's when Maria Santos arrived. The sound of rappelling gear echoed from the entrance passage, metal on stone, boots on rock. My backup had finally gotten here. I'd never been so relieved to hear another human being. "Tony," Maria's voice carried clearly through the chamber. "Where are you?" "In here," I shouted back. "Follow the passage past the river." Maria Santos was the best cave rescue specialist in the state. 38 years old, 20 years of experience, trained in technical rescue operations that would make Navy SEALs nervous. If anyone could help me figure out what was happening in Devil's Den, it was her. She emerged into the circular chamber 5 minutes later, her carbide lamp adding to the flickering light. Maria took one look at the breathing walls and the glowing symbols and didn't even blink. "Well," she said calmly, "that's new." "You see it too?" I asked, relieved that I wasn't losing my mind. "Hard to miss." She approached one of the symbol-covered walls and examined it closely. "These carvings aren't in any of our survey maps. This whole chamber isn't on the maps." "The missing cavers," I heard Sarah calling for help, "but I can't locate her." Maria nodded toward the 3 burning carbide lamps in the center of the chamber. "Their gear?" "Yeah, but it doesn't make sense. Those lamps should have burned out hours ago." She knelt beside Jim's lamp and checked the fuel level. Full, just like when I'd examined it. "Tony, we need to talk to someone about this cave system. Someone who knows the real history." "What do you mean?" "I stopped in town before coming up here. Talked to an old Cherokee man named Robert Soaring Eagle. He's been waiting for this day for 40 years. My skeptical mind immediately rebelled. "Maria, come on. We don't need folklore. We need to find those cavers. He told me the Cherokee have always known about the Watchers, said white people would eventually go too deep and wake them up. The chamber walls pulsed brighter, as if responding to her words. The scraping sounds started again, coming from passages I couldn't see. Multiple sources now, surrounding us. We need to get out of here, I said. Call for a full rescue team and proper equipment. But when we turned back toward the entrance passage, it was gone. The opening we'd come through had vanished. Solid limestone walls stretched from floor to ceiling, covered in those pulsing symbols. We were sealed inside a breathing stone chamber with no way out. Maria tested the wall with her hands, looking for hidden openings or loose rock. Nothing. The limestone was solid, warm, and very much alive. This isn't possible, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were meaningless. We were trapped inside a mountain that was rewriting its own geology around us. That's when we saw the first Watcher. Movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. A figure stood in the shadows at the edge of my light. Tall, humanoid, but wrong in ways that made my eyes water to look at it directly. When I swung my carbide lamp toward it, the figure melted back into the stone wall like it was made of the same limestone. "Did you see?" I started. "I saw it." Maria's voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath. 20 years of cave rescue, and she'd never encountered anything like this. More movement, multiple figures now standing just beyond our light. When we looked directly at them, they merged with the walls. When we looked away, they stepped closer. The Cherokee Stone Watchers, ancient guardians carved from living rock, protecting burial chambers from desecration. Everything Robert Soaring Eagle had told Maria was true. We'd gone too deep, disturbed something that was meant to stay undisturbed. "They're judging us," Maria said quietly, "testing whether we're worthy to be here." "Worthy of what?" Before she could answer, the chamber began to change. Passages opened in the walls where none had existed before. The ceiling rose higher, revealing carved figures that seemed to watch our every move. The floor shifted under our feet like flowing water, but remained solid limestone. We were inside something that was part cave, part living entity, part sacred temple, and it was deciding whether we deserved to leave alive. One of the new passages echoed with familiar voices. Jim, Sarah, and Mike, calling for help from somewhere deeper in the mountain. But their voices sounded different now, hollow, distant, as if they were speaking from inside the stone itself. "They failed the test," Maria said, understanding before I did. "The Watchers absorbed them, made them part of the cave system." The scraping sounds grew louder, more insistent. The stone figures were moving closer, no longer hiding in shadows. I could see them clearly now, 8 feet tall, carved from living limestone with eyes that glowed like phosphorus in dark water. They wanted us to follow the voices, to go deeper into chambers that might not let us return, to face whatever judgment they had prepared. "What happens if we fail?" I asked. Maria looked at the glowing symbols covering the walls, pulsing in rhythm with our heartbeats. "We become part of the mountain. Guardians like them, protecting Cherokee burial grounds for eternity." The Watchers stepped closer, their stone feet scraping against limestone, waiting for our decision. We could try to fight, but how do you fight living rock? We could refuse to move, but the chamber was already reshaping around us, giving us no choice. Or we could follow the voices deeper into the mountain and face whatever test the Watchers had prepared. "Robert Soaring Eagle," I said. "What exactly did he tell you about respecting the burial chambers?" Maria smiled grimly. "That's what I was hoping you'd ask." The stone Watchers loomed over us, and the mountain held its breath. Maria pulled out a small leather pouch from her rescue pack. "Robert gave me this before I came up here. Said if we encountered the Watchers, we'd need to show proper respect for Cherokee burial traditions." The pouch contained tobacco, sage, and small carved stones, traditional offering materials. The Watchers stood motionless as Maria knelt and began arranging the items in a careful pattern on the chamber floor. The Cherokee buried their dead in these deep chambers, she explained as she worked. Sacred places protected by spiritual guardians. When outsiders come with greed or disrespect, the Watchers judge them unworthy. And Jim, Sarah, Mike? They came here as scientists, explorers, taking measurements, making maps, treating sacred burial grounds like research sites. The Watchers saw desecration, not respect. One of the stone figures moved closer. Up close, I could see incredible detail in its construction. Every muscle, every bone, carved from living limestone with impossible precision. Its eyes weren't just glowing, they were looking at us with ancient intelligence. The Watcher spoke, but not with words. Vibrations ran through the stone floor, up through our feet, resonating in our chests like the world's deepest drumbeat. Somehow, I understood. Why do you disturb the resting place of our people? Maria continued her offering ritual, sprinkling tobacco in the traditional 4 directions. We came seeking lost ones. We meant no harm to those who sleep in stone. The lost ones took without asking, measured without permission, mapped sacred chambers like common caves. More Watchers emerged from the walls, a dozen of them now, surrounding us in a circle. Their combined presence made the air thick and heavy. The chamber walls breathed faster, and the symbols pulsed like warning lights. "You who comes from the coal mines," the nearest Watcher said, its attention focused on me. "Your people understand darkness and respect for those who die beneath stone." My father's words echoed in my memory. The ground speaks if you listen. Growing up in a coal mining family had taught me that mountains demand respect, that some places are sacred to the dead. "I understand," I said, kneeling beside Maria. "These chambers are resting places. We shouldn't have come here without permission. The Cherokee people asked us to guard their ancestors. We have done so for 500 years. White people come with lights and ropes, treating burial grounds like playgrounds." Watchers showed us the deeper chambers then, opening passages that led to vast underground spaces filled with ancient remains. Burial platforms carved from solid rock, pottery and jewelry left with the dead, sacred spaces that had been undisturbed since before Columbus reached America. And there, incorporated into the limestone walls themselves, were Jim, Sarah, and Mike. They weren't dead, not exactly. Their faces looked peaceful, eyes closed as if sleeping. But they were part of the mountain now, their bodies merged with the stone, becoming eternal guardians like the Watchers themselves. "They will protect these chambers forever," the lead Watcher explained. "As we have done, as you must choose to do." "There has to be another way," I said. "Some compromise that honors your traditions but doesn't." "One may stay, one may go. The guardian role requires sacrifice." Maria stood up slowly, her offering complete. The tobacco smoke rose in the still air, carrying our intentions to the watching spirits. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "Maria, no. We can figure something else out." She shook her head. "I've spent 20 years pulling people out of caves. Maybe it's time I helped guard them instead." She looked at the stone Watchers with something like wonder. "Think about it, Tony. Eternal purpose. Protecting something sacred that goes back centuries." The lead Watcher approached Maria and placed a massive stone hand on her shoulder. Where it touched, her skin began to change, not harming her, but starting the transformation that would make her part of the mountain. "You understand sacrifice," it said. "You will be a bridge between Cherokee ancestors and those who would disturb them, teaching respect to future generations." "What about me?" I asked. "You will return to the surface. You will tell others that some caves are not meant for exploration. You will help protect sacred places from those who would desecrate them." The chamber began changing around us again. New passages opened, leading upward toward the surface. The stone Watchers stepped aside, creating a clear path to freedom. But the path only had room for one person. Maria was already changing. Her skin took on the gray color of limestone. Her eyes began to glow with the same phosphorescent light as the Watchers. but she was smiling. "Tell Robert Soaring Eagle that the pact is renewed," she said. "The Watchers have a human guardian again." "Maria, go, Tony, before they change their minds." I wanted to argue to find some other solution, but I could feel the mountain's patience wearing thin. The breathing walls pulsed faster, the glowing symbols flared brighter. I took a step toward the passage that would lead me home, then turned back one last time. Maria was already part of the wall, her stone form standing among the Watchers. But her eyes still held human warmth, human intelligence. She would guard these burial chambers, teaching respect to anyone who ventured too deep. The Cherokee dead would rest in peace, protected by ancient spirits and a park ranger who understood the meaning of sacrifice. I climbed toward the surface, following passages that closed behind me as I passed. The mountain was letting me go, but it would never forget I'd been here. I emerged from Devil's Den just as the sun was setting, painting the Kentucky mountains in shades of gold and red. The rappel gear was still where I'd left it, the truck still parked at the trailhead. Everything looked normal, but I knew nothing would ever be normal again. My radio crackled to life as soon as I reached the surface. Dispatch had been trying to reach me for hours. I reported a cave-in that had claimed Maria Santos and left the 3 missing spelunkers unrecoverable. The official story that would go in the files. The real story was something else entirely. I drove to town and found Robert Soaring Eagle exactly where Maria had said he'd be, sitting on the porch of the general store, waiting. He took one look at my face and nodded. "The Watchers judged you worthy," he said. "Your friend chose to stay. Will she? She will guard our ancestors until the mountains crumble. There is no greater honor among our people." Robert told me about the network of protected sites throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Cherokee burial caves watched over by stone guardians, places where the living world and spirit world met, places that would defend themselves against desecration. "Your job now is to help us keep people away from the sacred places," he said. "The Watchers have given you the ability to sense them." He was right. Even sitting in town, I could feel the pull of protected spaces. Caves and burial grounds scattered throughout the mountains, each one guarded by entities that wouldn't hesitate to defend their charges. Over the next few months, I worked quietly to have Devil's Den and several other cave systems declared geologically unstable and closed to public exploration. The Cherokee Council helped by sharing information about traditional burial sites that needed protection. Sometimes, late at night, I dreamed of Maria standing among the Watchers in that breathing chamber. But they weren't nightmares. In the dreams, she looked happy, complete, like she'd found the purpose she'd been searching for her entire career. I stayed with the Park Service for another 10 years, becoming an expert on cave closures and safety restrictions. Officially, I was protecting people from dangerous geology. Unofficially, I was protecting sacred sites from people who didn't understand what they were disturbing. Robert Soaring Eagle became a close friend and advisor, teaching me to recognize the signs of spiritual protection around burial sites. Other Cherokee elders shared their knowledge, helping me understand the delicate balance between the living world and the realm of ancestors. Here were other incidents over the years. Explorers who went too deep into protected caves and never came out. Equipment found arranged in impossible patterns. Reports of figures made of living stone glimpsed in dark passages. Each time, I investigated quietly. Each time, I filed reports about equipment failures and geological instability. And each time, another sacred site was placed off-limits to casual exploration. The Cherokee Stone Watchers are still down there, guarding their ancestors' resting places. Maria is with them now, helping to bridge the gap between ancient traditions and modern ignorance. And somewhere in the mountains, other guardian networks protect sacred places we don't even know about. Most people think caves are just holes in the ground, natural formations to be mapped, explored, and conquered. They don't understand that some darkness is meant to stay undisturbed. Some places belong to the dead and their protectors. But I learned the truth in Devil's Den. The mountain taught me respect, and the Watchers showed me the difference between exploration and desecration. My name is Tony Castellano, and I've spent 36 years in these mountains. 26 of those years have been devoted to keeping people away from places they shouldn't go. Because some caves don't want to be explored. Some caves explore back. And in the deepest chambers, where Cherokee ancestors rest in limestone tombs, the watchers are always listening, always judging, always ready to add new guardians to their eternal ranks. Respect the darkness, where the dead sleep peacefully. Some mountains have longer memories than you think. My name is Thomas Whitmore, but everyone calls me Tom. I've been a park ranger for 18 years now, working the deep woods of West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest. People think it's a quiet job, but you'd be surprised what you find out here in the mountains. I grew up in these hills. My daddy worked the coal mines, and his daddy before him. We're mountain folk through and through. When I was little, my grandfather used to tell me stories about things that lived deeper than the mines. He called them the hollow folk. Pale things that never saw sunlight, living in caves and tunnels that went down forever. They've been here longer than us, he'd say, rocking on the porch while the wind howled through the trees. Longer than the Cherokee, longer than anyone. And they don't much like visitors. I never believed those stories. Mountain people love their ghost tales, and I figured that's all they were, stories to keep kids from wandering into dangerous mine shafts. My brother Danny used to laugh at those stories too. He worked the mines like Daddy, until the day a tunnel collapsed and took him and 6 other men. That was 15 years ago, and I still can't stand being underground. That's probably why I became a ranger. I needed the open sky and the mountain air. Now here I am, 44 years old, responsible for over 50,000 acres of forest. I know every trail, every creek, every old mine entrance in 3 counties. I've seen bears, wildcats, even caught a few moonshiners over the years. But I never saw anything that made me think twice about grandfather's stories. Until March of 1974. It started with 3 college boys from Virginia Tech. They were up here studying something called subsidence. Basically, how the ground sinks when old mines collapse underneath. Smart kids, all of them had fancy equipment and knew what they were doing. They'd been camping in Dead Man's Gap for a week, taking measurements and soil samples. Dead Man's Gap is about as lonely a place as you'll find in these mountains. It's a deep hollow between 2 ridges, 20 miles from the nearest road. An old coal town used to be there back in the 30s, but when the mine played out, folks just packed up and left. Now there's nothing but rotting foundations and rusted equipment, all tangled up in rhododendron thickets that never seem to get any sunlight. The Gap has a bad reputation with the locals. They say all the families that lived there just vanished one winter. Didn't pack up and move, just disappeared. The mine company claimed it was a disaster, a tunnel collapse that killed everyone. But no bodies were ever found. And that's when the stories about the hollow folk really got started. I should have known better than to let those college boys camp there alone. They had a radio schedule, supposed to check in with me every morning at 8 sharp. For 6 days, they did exactly that. Dr. Sarah Chen would get on the radio, tell me about their work, ask about the weather. Nice girl, probably around 25, working on her PhD. Her voice was always cheerful, excited about what they were finding. Then on the 7th day, nothing. I waited until noon, then tried calling them myself. Static. I tried different frequencies, checked my equipment. Everything worked fine, but I couldn't raise them. That's when I knew I had to go in. The hike to Dead Man's Gap takes about 6 hours on foot. I loaded my pack with emergency supplies, extra batteries for my flashlight, and my grandfather's old .357 revolver. I don't usually carry a gun on rescue calls, but something about the silence on that radio made me nervous. The weather wasn't helping. We'd had an early thaw that year, and the trails were slick with mud and melting snow. Creeks were running high, and more than once I had to find new ways around washed-out paths. By the time I reached the Gap, the sun was already behind the ridges, turning everything gray and cold. That's when I noticed. The first thing that wasn't right. The birds had stopped singing. I've spent most of my life in these woods, and I know their sounds like a mother knows her baby's cry. There should have been evening birds calling, robins, cardinals, maybe an owl starting up. Instead, there was nothing but the sound of water dripping from bare branches. Even the insects were quiet. I found the college kids' camp right where it should have been, in a small clearing near the old mine entrance. Their orange tent was still standing, guy ropes tight, no sign of damage. The fire ring had cold ashes, but that didn't mean much. Could have been out for hours or days. What bothered me was how neat everything was. I've seen plenty of abandoned campsites over the years. Usually when people leave in a hurry, things get scattered around, clothes hanging on branches, food left out, equipment dropped wherever. But this camp looked like someone had organized it. The backpacks were arranged in a perfect line, smallest to largest. The cooking gear was stacked in precise piles. Even the rocks around the fire pit had been moved into a pattern, not random like you'd expect, but in careful rows that formed triangles and diamonds. No human being arranges rocks like that. I called out, hoping maybe they'd just gone for a walk. "Dr. Chen, this is Ranger Whitmore." My voice echoed off the ridge walls, but nobody answered back. I checked inside their tent. 3 sleeping bags, still zipped up neat and tidy, personal items folded and stacked like they were in a display case. I found Dr. Chen's notebook, and the last entry was from 3 days ago. Discovered unusual cave formation. Limestone chambers extend much deeper than survey maps indicate. Strange acoustic properties. Sounds carry for impossible distances. That gave me a chill. These kids had found something. I looked around the camp again, trying to piece together what had happened. That's when I noticed the footprints. The mud around the camp showed 3 sets of boot prints, obviously from the college students. But mixed in with them were other prints. Bare feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like 6 toes instead of 5, and they were pale. I'd seen plenty of footprints over the years, but these looked like they'd been pressed into the mud by something that had never seen sunlight. The skin was so white it was almost blue, like something that had been underwater too long. The bare footprints led toward the old mine entrance. Now, I should explain something about abandoned mines. They're death traps. Gases build up that can kill you. The supports rot away, and old shafts can drop straight down for hundreds of feet. The first rule of rescue work is never go into an abandoned mine alone. But 3 people were missing, and those footprints were fresh. I got my flashlight and headed for the mine entrance. It had been sealed up decades ago with concrete and steel, but someone had been digging. Fresh dirt was piled around the opening, and I could see that part of the seal had been broken away. The hole was just big enough for a person to crawl through. The strange thing was, all the digging had been done by hand. No tool marks, just gouges in the earth like someone had used their bare fingers, and some of those finger marks showed 6 digits instead of 5. I knelt down and shined my light into the opening. Cool air flowed out, carrying a smell like old metal and wet stone. But underneath that was something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left out too long. From somewhere deep in the darkness came a sound. It started so low I felt it more than heard it, a humming that seemed to come up through the ground into my bones. Then it got higher, turning into something, almost like singing, if singing could sound like wind through a broken window. I'd never heard anything like it in my life, but somehow it felt familiar, like a song I'd known as a child, but forgotten. That's when I saw the light. Deep in the tunnel, maybe 100 yards down, something was glowing with a pale blue light. It flickered and moved, like it was alive, and as I watched, it started getting brighter. Something was coming up the tunnel toward me. I scrambled backward from the opening, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far from that place as possible. But 3 people were down there, and they were depending on me to find them. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Whitmore at Dead Man's Gap. I need backup and a full cave rescue team. We have 3 missing persons in an abandoned mine system." Static answered me. Then that humming sound started coming through the radio speaker, low and alien and wrong. I tried switching frequencies, but every channel carried the same impossible sound. Finally, I turned the radio off, but I could still hear it echoing from the tunnel entrance. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. I was going to come back with help. I should have left right then. Should have hiked back to my truck and gotten the cave rescue team from Charleston. But as I was packing up to leave, I heard something that stopped me cold. A woman's voice, calling for help. It was coming from somewhere beyond the mine entrance, faint but clear. "Please," the voice said. "Someone help us." It sounded like Dr. Chen. I couldn't leave. Not when someone was alive down there and calling for help. I grabbed my rope, extra flashlight batteries, and the emergency flares from my pack. Then I crawled through that hole into the darkness. The tunnel was bigger inside than I'd expected. Old wooden supports held up the ceiling, though some had rotted away and left gaps where rocks had fallen. My flashlight beam only reached about 20 feet ahead, making everything beyond that look like a wall of black woduyas. Ader. The humming was louder down here. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the rock and into my skull. And that smell was getting stronger, not just rotting meat now, but something sweet and sick underneath it. I followed the main tunnel for maybe 200 yards before it opened into a natural cave system. This wasn't part of the old mine. This was something that had been here long before humans ever dug into these mountains. The ceiling stretched up beyond my light, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness above. The rock walls were smooth, almost polished, with strange markings carved into them. Not writing exactly, but patterns that hurt to look at. Spirals and angles that seemed to twist and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. That's where I found Eddie Mullins. Eddie was another ranger, about 10 years younger than me. He must have come looking when I didn't report back. He was standing with his back to me, perfectly still, about 30 feet into the cave. "Eddie," I called out. "Thank God you're here. We need to get these people out." He didn't answer. Didn't even turn around. I walked closer, calling his name. When I got about 10 feet away, I could see why he wasn't responding. Eddie was standing in a puddle of that pale blue light, and his skin had turned the same white color as those footprints. His eyes were open, but they reflected my flashlight beam, like an animal's. And when I listened carefully, I could hear him humming along with that sound coming from the walls. He wasn't Eddie anymore. Not really. "Eddie," I whispered. "What happened to you?" He turned toward me then, and I saw that his face was still the same, but empty somehow, like someone had taken away everything that made him human and left just the shell. When he opened his mouth to speak, 6 voices came out at once, all humming that same alien song. I ran. Behind me I heard Eddie, or whatever Eddie had become, following, but he moved wrong. Like his joints didn't bend the way they should. I could hear him bumping into the cave walls, and that terrible humming got louder with each step. The tunnel branched ahead of me. I chose the left passage, hoping it would lead back toward the entrance. Instead, it curved deeper into the mountain, opening into chamber after chamber of that polished rock. And I wasn't alone down there. They were waiting in the shadows. Tall, pale figures that moved just at the edge of my flashlight beam. I'd catch glimpses of them between the rock formations, 2 long arms, faces that were almost human but stretched like taffy, and those 6-fingered hands that had dug through the mine seal. The hollow folk. Every time I turned my light directly on them, they'd melt back into the darkness. But I could feel them watching, and that humming sound was getting stronger. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore, it was coming from them. I found Dr. Chen in the deepest chamber. She was sitting cross-legged on the cave floor, staring up at the ceiling with those same empty, reflecting eyes. Her skin was starting to turn pale, and when she saw me, she smiled with too many teeth. "Ranger Whitmore," she said, but her voice had that same multi-toned quality as Eddie's. "We've been waiting for you." "Where are the other students?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. She pointed to 2 other figures standing in the shadows. They had the same pale skin, the same empty eyes. One of them waved at me with a hand that had too many fingers. "They're with us now," Dr. Chen said. "They understand. They're part of something bigger." That's when the hollow folk stepped out of the shadows. They were everything my grandfather had described and worse. 7 feet tall, with skin like wet paper and heads that were too big for their bodies. Their eyes had no color at all, just black holes that seemed to go on forever. And when they opened their mouths, I see would see rows of teeth like broken glass. But the worst part was the sound they made. It wasn't just humming anymore. It was like music, but music that was never meant for human ears. It got inside my head, making my thoughts fuzzy and slow. One of them reached out toward me with those six-fingered hands. "Join us," it said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "Join the song." I could feel myself starting to listen, starting to understand what that impossible music meant. It would be so easy to just give in, to let them take away all the worry and pain and fear, to become part of something that had been singing in the dark since before humans learned to make fire. But then I thought about my brother Danny, crushed in that mine tunnel 15 years ago. I thought about Eddie, standing empty-eyed in that puddle of alien light. I thought about those 3 college kids, transformed into something that wasn't human anymore. And I got mad. The anger cleared my head like a slap across the face. These things had taken people I was supposed to protect, turned them into something else. And now they wanted me too. "No," I said, loud enough that my voice echoed through the chamber. The hollow folk tilted their oversized heads like they couldn't understand what I meant. "I said no." I pulled out my grandfather's .357 and pointed it at the nearest one. They didn't seem afraid of the gun. In fact, they started to laugh, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. The music got louder, more insistent, trying to wrap around my mind again. But I had something they didn't expect. Growing up in a coal mining family teaches you a lot about explosives. Every miner knows how to handle dynamite, how to calculate blast patterns, how to bring down rocks safely. And I'd brought some supplies of my own. While they were concentrating on their hypnotic song, I pulled out the 3 emergency flare, as from my pack. These weren't ordinary flares. They were magnesium charges, hot enough to melt steel and bright as the sun. "You want to sing?" I said, pulling the first igniter. "Let's see. How you like this music?" The flare burst to life with a white light so brilliant it turned the cave into day. The hollow folk shrieked and fell back, covering their eyes with those pale hands. Their song broke apart into discord and pain. I didn't waste time. I lit the second flare and threw it deeper into the chamber, then the third one toward the tunnel entrance. The light was so bright it hurt my own eyes, but I could see what it was doing to them. Their pale skin was blistering and smoking. They stumbled around like they were blind, crying out in voices that sounded like breaking glass. And where the light hit the carved walls, those twisted symbols started to crack and crumble. "The light," I yelled to Dr. Chen and the others. "Fight the song. Remember who you are." For just a moment I saw something human flicker in Dr. Chen's eyes. She looked around like she was waking up from a dream, confused and scared. But the hollow folk weren't finished yet. The biggest one, their leader, I guess, stood up despite the burning light. Its skin was smoking and peeling, but those black hole eyes were fixed on me with pure hate. "You do not understand," it said in that wind voice. "We are the deep singers. We were here before your kind learned to walk upright. We will be here when your cities are dust." It raised one 6-fingered hand, and the remaining symbols on the walls began to glow with that cold blue light. "We take what we need," it continued. "Consciousness, thought, the spark that makes you more than meat. We have fed on your kind for thousands of years, and we will continue long after you are forgotten." The light from my flares was starting to fade. Soon we'd be back in the dark with these things, and I didn't have any more tricks to play. That's when I remembered what my grandfather used to say. Sometimes the only way out is to bring the whole thing down. I suppose Till had my miner's knowledge, and I could see the structural weak points in this chamber. The ceiling was supported by natural rock formations, but they'd been carved and hollowed out by these creatures over the centuries. A good blast in the right place would bring the whole thing crashing down. The problem was, I didn't have any real explosives. But I had something almost as good. My emergency kit included a small canister of compressed gas for inflating rescue rafts. It wasn't meant to be a weapon, but compressed gas plus an open flame equals a pretty good boom. I grabbed the canister and my cigarette lighter. "Dr. Chen!" I yelled. "Can you hear me?" She nodded, still looking confused but more human than before. "When I tell you to run, you head for the tunnel as fast as you can. Don't look back, don't stop, just run." The hollow folk leader was getting closer, its burned skin already starting to heal in the fading flare light. Behind it, the others were recovering too, and their song was building again. I aimed the gas canister at the ceiling above them and flicked my lighter. Run! The explosion wasn't huge, but it was enough. The ceiling cracked with a sound like thunder, and chunks of rock started raining down. The hollow folk scattered, their song turning into screams of fear and rage. Dr. Chen stumbled toward me, no longer moving with that eerie coordination. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the tunnel entrance as the chamber collapsed behind us. We crawled through falling rock and clouds of dust, my flashlight beam jumping wildly as we scrambled for the surface. Behind us, I could hear the hollow folk calling out in their alien voices, but the sound was getting fainter. When we finally burst out of the mine entrance into the cold mountain air, I've never been so happy to see stars in my life. Dr. Chen collapsed beside me, coughing up rock dust and looking around like she didn't know where she was. "What happened to me?" she whispered. "I remember going into the cave, but then nothing. Just music, and feeling like I was part of something huge and old and hungry." I helped her to her feet. "We need to get out of here, now." But even as we started back toward the trail, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. From deep underground, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of digging. We made it back to my truck just as the sun was coming up. Dr. Chen was in shock, wrapped in my spare jacket and shivering despite the warming air. She remembered fragments of what had happened. The music that got inside your head. The feeling of becoming part of something vast and alien. The sense that her individual self was dissolving into a larger consciousness. "The others," she kept saying. "What about the others?" I didn't have the heart to tell her that the 2 graduate students were probably still down there, changed into something that wasn't human anymore, or that Eddie Mullins, a good man and a fine ranger, was lost to whatever collective mind the hollow folk shared. The official report listed it as a mining accident. The entrance to Dead Man's Gap was sealed with concrete and steel, then covered with earth and planted with trees. Signs were posted warning about unstable ground and toxic gases. The area was quietly added to a federal environmental protection zone, which meant no one could dig there without permission that would never come. Dr. Chen spent 3 months in a psychiatric facility, officially being treated for trauma and exposure-related hallucinations. When she got out, she'd changed her major from geology to music therapy. She said she wanted to help people who heard things that weren't there. I requested a transfer to surface patrol only. Told my supervisor that I'd developed claustrophobia after the cave-in. It wasn't entirely a lie. I haven't been able to go underground since that day, and probably never will again. But the real reason I can't do cave rescue anymore is the deconad, Reams. Every night I hear that music. The deep, harmonic singing of the hollow folk. It starts quiet, like a lullaby, but it gets louder and more insistent until I wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes I catch myself humming along, and that scares me more than anything, because I think part of me is still down there, still connected to whatever network of consciousness exists in those deep places. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I can feel them calling me back. The worst part is that they're not gone. Over the past few months, I've gotten reports from other rangers throughout Appalachia. Sealed mine entrances showing signs of excavation. Hikers disappearing near old coal sites. Animals avoiding certain areas for no apparent reason. And always, there are stories of music coming from underground. I keep a map in my office now, marking every incident with a red pin. The pattern that's emerging keeps me awake at night. The hollow folk aren't confined to one mine system. They're connected through natural cave networks that run through hundreds of miles of mountain territory. They're spreading. Last week, I got a call from a ranger in Kentucky. 3 spelunkers had gone missing in the Mammoth Cave system. When the rescue team found their campsite, all their gear was arranged in geometric patterns, and there were pale, 6-fingered handprints on the cave walls. I know I should report what I know to someone higher up the chain, but who would believe me? And even if they did, what could be done? These things have been down there longer than human civilization. They survived the ice ages, the extinction of the dinosaurs, probably the formation of the mountains themselves. We're not dealing with monsters that can be hunted or destroyed. We're dealing with an older form of intelligence that sees humans the way we might see cattle. Useful for their resources, but not worth considering as equals. So I keep doing my job. I patrol the surface trails, help lost hikers, file my reports, and try not to think about what might be happening in the dark places beneath my feet. But every now and then, when the wind blows through the mountains at night, I hear something that makes me stop and listen. It sounds like singing, if singing could carry for miles underground. It sounds like a call, patient and persistent and hungry. And the terrible thing is, part of me wants to answer. If you're reading this, and you're planning to explore caves or abandoned mines in coal country, let me give you some advice. If you hear music coming from underground, walk away. If you find your gear arranged in patterns you didn't make, walk away. If you see pale handprints with 6 fingers, run. Some things are better left in the dark. But I have a feeling the dark won't be content to leave us alone much longer. The hollow folk are patient, but they're also hungry. And there are a lot of abandoned mines in these mountains. More every year as the old coal industry dies out. Each one is a potential doorway, a way for something ancient and inhuman to reach up toward the surface world. I've started sleeping with my grandfather's 357 under my pillow and a box of road flares by my bed. Not because I think they'll stop what's coming, but because when the time comes, I want to go down fighting. And I want to make sure I go down as myself, not as something else wearing my face and humming their impossible songs. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I've been a park ranger for 18 years, and I've seen things in these mountains that no one should have to see. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know the truth about what's down there in the deep places. Someone needs to be ready, because I don't think I'm going to be around much longer to tell it myself. The music is getting louder every night. My name is Michael Brennan, but everyone calls me Mick. I've been a ranger in the George Washington National Forest for 13 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these Virginia mountains could throw at me. Black bears, timber rattlers, the occasional mountain lion that wandered too far east. I was wrong. It was October 1981 when it all started. The leaves were turning that perfect autumn gold, and the tourist season was winding down. That meant fewer people on the trails and more time for me to focus on what I do best: wildlife management and predator control. I'm good at my job. Marine Corps training will do that for you. Sniper school teaches you patience, and patience is what you need when you're tracking animals through 30 square miles of ridge country. Black Rock Ridge sits about 30 miles west of the Blue Ridge Parkway, accessible only on foot. It's old Cherokee hunting ground, and during the Civil War, guerrillas used to hide out in the caves up there. The rock formations make perfect cover, and the dense hardwood forest can swallow a man whole if he doesn't know what he's doing. I know what I'm doing. The first complaint came from Tom McCready, whose farm sits at the base of the ridge. He lost 3 cattle in 2 weeks, and the way they were killed didn't make sense. I drove out to his place on a cold Tuesday morning, my breath making clouds in the air as I examined the carcass. "Look at this, Mick," Tom said, pointing to the wounds on his prize heifer. "Tell me what kind of animal did this." I knelt down, studying the bite marks. They were wrong. The spacing was all off. Too wide for a coyote, too narrow for a bear. And they changed. Along the same wound, I could see marks that looked like wolf bites next to others that seemed to come from something with smaller, sharper teeth. "Could be multiple predators," I told Tom, but even as I said, I didn't believe it. Predators don't share kills like that. They fight over them. "There's something else," Tom said, leading me to the edge of his property where the forest began. "Look at these tracks." The tracks were impossible. They started as boot prints, clear human footprints in the soft mud near Tom's water trough, but 20 feet later, they changed to wolf paws, then bear claws. Then something I'd never seen before, with 5 long digits and what looked like human toe marks. I took pictures with my camera and made plaster casts. 13 years of wildlife management, and I'd never seen anything like it. Back at the ranger station, I spread out topographical maps of Black Rock Ridge and marked the attack site with a red pin. Probably just some kids playing pranks, I told myself, but I was already planning my first trip up to the ridge. I loaded my pack with the usual gear: modified Remington 700 with tranquilizer darts, radio, first aid kit, trail cameras, and my Cherokee tracking guide from when I first started the job. That night, I called Joseph Crow Feather, our tribal liaison. Joseph's family has lived in these mountains for generations, and he knows things about the land that don't get written in ranger handbooks. Tom McCready's been losing cattle, I told him. Strange bite patterns, weird tracks. You heard anything from your people about unusual animal activity up on the ridge? There was a long pause. What kind of tracks, Mick? I described what I'd seen, and I heard Joseph take a sharp breath. Stay off the ridge for a few days, he said. Let me make some calls. Come on, Joseph, it's probably just a rabid animal or something. I've got to investigate. Mick, he said, and his voice was serious in a way I'd never heard before. Some boundaries were put in place for good reasons. The old people, they marked certain areas for a reason. AFF. Terror. I hung up. I sat in my cabin looking at the photos I'd taken. The more I stared at them, the more wrong they looked. It was like looking at puzzle pieces that had been forced together from different boxes. I've always been a practical man. Irish Catholic upbringing, Marine Corps discipline, 13 years of dealing with real problems in real forests. Shapeshifters and skinwalkers were Navajo legends from Arizona desert country, not Virginia mountain reality. But as I looked at those impossible tracks, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first firefight in Vietnam. The cold certainty that I was dealing with something completely outside my understanding. The next morning, I packed my gear and headed for Black Rock Ridge anyway. The trail up to Black Rock Ridge winds through some of the most beautiful country in Virginia. October mornings are crisp and clear with that perfect light filtering through the canopy. Usually the forest is alive with sound. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant drum of woodpeckers. That morning, the silence was absolute. I'm used to quiet forests. Sometimes animals go still when predators are around. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the forest itself was holding its breath. 3 miles up the trail, I found my first trail camera smashed to pieces. The metal housing was twisted like it had been crushed in a giant fist, and the lens was shattered. I knelt down to examine it, and that's when I noticed the smell. It was wrong. Animal, but not animal. Like wet dog mixed with something rotten and something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my nose burn and my stomach turn. I set up a new camera 20 yards away and kept climbing. The path gets steeper as you approach the ridge proper, winding through rock formations that tower overhead like ancient sentinels. Cherokee used to consider this area sacred. I was starting to understand why. Halfway up, I found the first kill site. A deer lay twisted among the fallen leaves, but it had been anged. That's the only word for it. The legs were positioned in perfect angles like someone had taken care to make it symmetrical. The wounds were fresh. So fresh that steam was still rising from the exposed flesh in the cold air. But the bite patterns were impossible. One side of the throat showed canine punctures consistent with a large wolf. The other side had been torn by claws, bare claws from the spacing. And along the belly, smaller bites that looked almost human. I photographed everything, trying to stay professional. Trying to think like the trained wildlife manager I was supposed to be, but my hands were shaking as I adjusted the camera settings. That's when I heard the voice. Help me! It came from deeper in the forest, thin and desperate. Human. I grabbed my rifle and moved toward the sound, stepping carefully around the arranged deer carcass. Hello? I called out. Where are you? Help me, please. A woman's voice, scared and weak. I'm hurt. I followed the voice through a stand of oak trees, my rifle ready. The smell was getting stronger, that wrong burning smell that made my eyes water. Through the trees ahead, I could see movement. I'm a park ranger, I called out. I'm here to help. I pushed through the last line of trees and stopped dead. There was no woman. Instead, standing in a small clearing, was a wolf. But it was wrong, too big, with pale yellow eyes that held too much intelligence. When it saw me, it sat back on its haunches and tilted its head, almost like it was studying me. "Help me," it said in the woman's voice. "I've been hunting since I was 12 years old. I know animal behavior. Wolves don't talk. Wolves don't sit and stare at you like they're trying to figure out what you're thinking. This thing did both. I raised my rifle, not sure whether to load tranquilizer darts or regular ammunition. The wolf watched me with those. It had two smart eyes. "You can't help her," it said. And now the voice was different. Male, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "She's already gone." I squeezed the trigger. The tranquilizer dart hit the wolf center mass, and it looked down at the dart, protruding from its chest with what I swear was amusement. "That won't work on me, Ranger Brennan." It knew my name. The wolf began to change, not like in the movies, with dramatic music and special effects. This was quiet, organic, horrible. The fur receded, the muzzle shortened, limbs elongated. In less than 30 seconds, where the wolf had been sitting, there was now a man. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing what looked like military fatigues from 20 years ago. His face was lean and weathered, with the same pale yellow eyes. When he smiled, his teeth were too sharp. "Don't be afraid, Mick," he said, standing up and brushing leaves off his clothes. "We have so much to talk about." I fired again, this time with a regular cartridge. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He looked at the wound with mild irritation, like he'd been stung by a bee. "That was rude," he said. The bullet hole was already closing. I ran. Behind me I could hear laughter that turned into a howl that turned into something else entirely. Something that sounded like multiple voices speaking in harmony. I crashed through the underbrush, my pack bouncing against my back, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I spent that night in my cabin, cleaning my rifle and trying to convince myself I'd had some kind of breakdown. PTSD, maybe. Combat veterans sometimes had delayed reactions years after the war ended. That made more sense than talking wolves and shape-shifting men. But when I developed the photos from my camera, the evidence was all there. The impossible tracks, the arranged deer, and in one shot, barely visible through the trees, a pale figure that could have been human or could have been something else entirely. The next morning, Joseph Crow Feth Fire was waiting for me at the ranger station. "You went up to the ridge," he said. It wasn't a question. I told him everything. The silence in the forest, the arranged kill, the thing that had spoken to me in different voices. Joseph listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each detail. "Skinwalker," he said when I finished. "That's Navajo mythology, Joseph. We're in Virginia. Evil doesn't respect tribal boundaries, Mick." He pulled out an old leather journal and flipped through pages covered in Cherokee syllabary and English translations. My grandmother wrote about them, called them those who wear false skins, said they came from government men who tried to make soldiers into something else. Government men? Joseph showed me a page in the journal dated 1953. There was a facility up on the ridge, biological research. My grandmother cleaned their buildings sometimes, said they were doing things to volunteers, trying to make them into perfect soldiers. The project ended badly. Before I could ask more questions, a black sedan pulled up outside the station. A man in a dark suit got out, adjusted his tie, and walked through the front door like he owned the place. "Ranger Brennan? Agent Smith, Environmental Protection Agency. I understand you've been investigating some unusual animal activity on Black Rock Ridge." He was too clean, too perfect. His suit was expensive, his shoes were polished, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. He looked like every federal agent I'd ever met, right down to the cheap briefcase and the way he stood with his feet precisely shoulder-width apart. "Just routine predator management," I said. "Of course. However, we've detected some environmental contamination in that area. Old military testing site. I'm afraid we'll need to restrict access for a few weeks while we conduct a cleanup operation." Joseph was staring at Agent Smith with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. "What kind of testing?" I asked. "Classified, I'm afraid. Biological warfare research from The 50s. Nothing dangerous now, but we want to be thorough. Smith opened his briefcase and pulled out official-looking documents. I'll need you to sign off on the area restriction and turn over any evidence you've collected from the ridge. I looked at the papers. Everything was in order. Federal letterhead, proper signatures, even a contact number for EPA headquarters. But something was wrong. The paper was too new, too crisp. And Agent Smith smelled like that burning animal smell I'd encountered on the ridge. I need to make some calls first, I said, verify the authority. Smith's perfect smile flickered for just a moment. Of course. Take all the time you need. After he left, Joseph grabbed my arm. That wasn't a federal agent, Mick. What do you mean? The smell. You noticed the smell? I had. That wrong, burning smell that made my stomach turn. And his eyes, Joseph continued. When he was looking at those papers, his eyes were yellow. That night, I called EPA headquarters in Washington. They had never heard of Agent Smith. The phone number on his business card was disconnected. The testing site he'd mentioned didn't exist in any federal records, but something was testing on Black Rock Ridge. Something had been testing for almost 30 years. I loaded fresh ammunition into my rifle, silver bullets I'd cast myself after a strange conversation with Joseph about what might hurt a skinwalker. Then I drove back to the ridge, but this time I approached from the north, using old hunting trails my grandfather had shown me as a boy. The abandoned facility was hidden in a valley on the far side of the ridge, invisible from any of the main trails. Concrete buildings covered with 30 years of vines, their windows dark and empty. Most of the complex was collapsing, but one building still had lights on. I approached carefully, using my military training to stay invisible. Through a broken window, I could see inside. Agent Smith was there, but he wasn't alone. There were 3 other figures, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the same kind of old military fatigues I'd seen before. They were standing around a table covered with maps and photographs. My photographs. The ranger is becoming a problem, Smith was saying. But his voice was different now. Rougher, with an accent I recognized as Cherokee. We could absorb him, one of the others replied. Add his knowledge to the collective. No, Smith said. He has local connections. His disappearance would be noticed. That's when I realized what I was looking at. These weren't 4 different people. They were 4 different bodies being used by the same thing. The same consciousness moving between different stolen shapes. The woman turned toward the window, and I saw her eyes were the same pale yellow I'd seen in the forest. She smiled, and I knew she could see me in the darkness. Hello, Mick, she said. Why don't you come in? We have so much to discuss. I ran through the forest with 4 sets of footsteps behind me, but they weren't human footsteps. Sometimes they sounded like boots on leaves, sometimes like paws, sometimes like claws scraping against stone. The sounds kept changing, and they were getting closer. My truck was parked 3 miles away, but I knew I'd never make it. Whatever was chasing me could move faster than anything natural, and it knew these woods as well as I did. Maybe better. I remembered what Joseph had told me about Cherokee sacred sites, about boundaries marked for good reasons. There was a spring near the top of the ridge, a place his grandmother had said was protected by the old ceremonies. If I could reach it, maybe I'd have a chance. The forest was alive with sounds now, not the natural sounds of animals, but voices. Dozens of voices calling. My name, pleading for help, screaming in pain. The skinwalker wasn't just one entity. It was a collection, a hive mind made up of everyone it had absorbed over the decades. I recognized some of the voices. Tom McCready's son, who'd gone missing 5 years ago. A female hiker who'd disappeared on the Appalachian Trail in 1978. A park ranger from West Virginia who'd been investigating cattle mutilations and never came home. We're still here, Mick, they called out in chorus. Still trapped inside. You could help us. You could join us. I reached the spring just as the first one caught up to me. It looked like Agent Smith, but larger, more muscular. Its fingers had extended into claws, and when it smiled, I could see rows of sharp teeth like a shark's mouth. You can't run forever, Ranger Brennan, it said in a voice that was part Smith, part wolf growl, part something else entirely. And you can't fight what you don't understand. Then help me understand, I said, raising my rifle. The silver bullets might not kill it, but Joseph had said they would hurt it, maybe slow it down. We were soldiers once, the Smith thing said, circling me like a predator. Volunteers for something called Project Metamorphosis. The government wanted perfect warriors, soldiers who could adapt to any situation, any environment. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. 2 more figures emerged from the trees, the woman and one of the men from the facility. But they were changing as they moved, shifting between human and animal forms like their bodies couldn't decide what they were supposed to be. The transformation was supposed to be temporary, the woman said. We were supposed to be able to shift back and forth at will, but something went wrong. We got stuck between shapes, between identities. So we learned to take new ones. Every person we absorb makes us more complete, the third figure added. More human. We're not monsters, Mick. We're evolution. I backed toward the spring, feeling the cold water splash against my boots. The Cherokee had carved symbols into the rocks around the water source. Protection symbols, according to Joseph. I didn't know if they would work, but they were the only chance I had. Why the cattle? I asked, trying to buy time while I looked for an escape route. Why not just take people? Practice, Smith said. Learning to use different bodies, different instincts. A wolf's hunting patterns, a bear's strength, a human's intelligence. We're preparing. For what? The 3 figures smiled identical smiles with too many teeth. To go home, they said in unison. To return to civilization. To spread. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about one skinwalker hiding in the Virginia mountains. This was about infiltration, about replacing people in positions of authority. How many Agent Smiths were there? How many federal agents, local sheriffs, park rangers had already been replaced? The Smith thing lunged at me, moving faster than anything human should be able to move. I fired, and the silver bullet caught its center mass. It screamed, not with one voice but with dozens, all the absorbed personalities crying out in pain simultaneously. It stumbled backward, clutching its chest, and I could see the wound smoking. Silver worked. But the other 2 were already moving, circling around to flank me. I had 4 bullets left, and I was standing knee-deep in a Cherokee sacred spring, hoping 30-year-old protection ceremonies would keep me alive. The woman thing reached for me with claws that were growing longer by the second. I shot her in the shoulder, spinning her around. She hit the ground hard, but she was already getting back up. "Joseph!" I screamed, not really expecting an answer. "Joseph, if you can hear me, I need help!" The wind through the trees sounded like laughter, but then I heard it, singing. Low, rhythmic Cherokee chanting coming from somewhere in the forest. Joseph's voice speaking. Words I didn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. The skinwalkers heard it too. They stopped their attack, looking around nervously. "Impossible," the Smith thing said. "The old ways don't work anymore." But they did. The singing got louder, and I could see light flickering between the trees. Torchlight moving in a circle around the spring. The protection circle was being renewed, strengthened by someone who knew how to work the old ceremonies. The skinwalkers tried to rush me all at once, but when they reached the edge of the spring, they stopped, like they'd hit an invisible wall. Smoke rose from their feet where they touched the blessed water. I had 2 bullets left, and I made them count. Silver rounds to the head, fired at point-blank range while they were trapped at the water's edge. The creatures collapsed, their stolen bodies dissolving like smoke. But as they died, I could hear all the voices they'd absorbed, all the people they'd taken over the decades. Some were screaming, but some were saying, "Thank you." Joseph found me 3 hours later, sitting by the spring with an empty rifle and tears on my face. I'd heard the voices of the absorbed victims as the skinwalker died. 30 years of stolen lives, stolen identities, stolen futures. Some of them had been aware the whole time, trapped inside a collective consciousness that used their bodies like tools. "It's over?" he asked. I nodded, but I wasn't sure. "Joseph, There were government files in that facility. Project Metamorphosis. What if this wasn't the only test site? He helped me to my feet and we walked back through the forest together. The silence was different now. Natural. Peaceful. Birds were singing again, and I could hear squirrels chattering in the trees. Then we'll deal with those when we find them, he said. But for now, this part of the mountain is clean. A week later, the military showed up with trucks and heavy equipment. They claimed it was an environmental cleanup operation, just like the fake Agent Smith had said. They removed every trace of the old facility, filled in the foundations with concrete, and planted trees where the buildings had been. I was transferred to administrative duties with a security clearance I'd never asked for. The official report listed the cattle deaths as caused by a rabid wolf pack that had been successfully eliminated. Tom McCready received compensation from the federal government for his losses, and his family was relocated to North Carolina with full benefits. The real Agent Patterson's body was found in a cave system on the far side of the ridge, along with the remains of 17 other people dating back to the 1950s. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and animal predation, but I know better. And now, 3 years later, I keep hearing reports from other national forests. Cattle mutilations in Tennessee. Hikers disappearing in Kentucky. Always the same pattern. Impossible tracks, arranged kill sites, witnesses who describe animals that act too human. Joseph and I have been consulting with other tribal liaisons, sharing what we learned. The Cherokee protection ceremonies work, but they require knowledge that's been carefully guarded for generations. We're training other rangers, teaching them to recognize the signs. Because Project Metamorphosis involved 12 test subjects, according to the classified files I was allowed to see. We found one. That means 11 are still out there, still infiltrating, still spreading. Sometimes I dream about those voices I heard when the skinwalker died. All those people who were absorbed, who spent decades trapped inside a collective consciousness, aware but unable to control their own bodies. I wake up wondering how many people in positions of authority aren't really people anymore. The government has given me a new job title, Special Liaison for Biological Anomalies. It sounds bureaucratic and boring, which is exactly what they want. But what it really means is that when reports come in about impossible predations and shape-shifting creatures, I'm the one they call. Joseph was right about respecting the old boundaries. The Cherokee marked certain areas as dangerous for good reasons. But now we know it wasn't just spiritual danger they were warning about. It was scientific danger, government danger, the kind of danger that comes from people who think they can improve on nature without understanding the consequences. I still patrol the mountains, still investigate predator reports, still carry silver bullets in my rifle. Because somewhere out there, 11 enhanced soldiers are wearing stolen faces and stolen lives, preparing for the day when they feel ready to return to civilization. The skinwalker of Black Rock Ridge is dead. But the project that created it is still active, still spreading, still adapting. And now I'm one of the people responsible for stopping it. The forest keeps its secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried. Every time I hear reports of cattle killed in impossible ways, every time a hiker disappears without a trace, every time a federal agent shows up asking questions that don't quite make sense, I remember those yellow eyes and that wrong, burning smell. The hunt isn't over. It's just beginning.